President-elect Donald Trump has turned a lot of heads recently with some of his cabinet picks, including his pick for chair of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, Brendan Carr. The head of the FCC will oversee the agency that regulates U.S. Internet access and communications networks such as TV and radio. Carr believes it's, quote, an institution ripe for change. That's according to the chapter he wrote in Project 2025 about the FCC. Now, to shed some light on it for us is Ian Rosenberg, an FCC and media law expert. Ian, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about Brendan Carr. Exactly who is he? What's he all about?
So Brendan Carr, as you know, is the senior Republican commissioner on the FCC. He's been one of the 5 members of the commission who sets policy for the communication agency. He was a former general counsel of the FCC, and he is closely aligned, his views are closely aligned with President Trump's policy goals. As you mentioned, he wrote the Project 2025 chapter on the FCC, and he also criticized Vice President Harris a number of times publicly during the campaign. Trump calls Carr a warrior for free speech, but it's some of those free speech comments that have been generating a lot of controversy.
And let me ask you, you're talking about the posts on the social media platform X.
Yes.
This was a couple of hours after the appointment, after he thanked soon-to-be President Trump once again. Let's take a look at that. We must dismantle the censorship cartel and restore free speech rights for everyday Americans. How do you read into that?
Well, it's a very interesting statement. First of all, it wasn't clear from that post who is this censorship cartel. Yeah. But if you look back to a letter he had written a week earlier and posted, he had addressed this letter to the CEOs of Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Apple, accusing those companies of having a significant role to play in what he called an unprecedented surge of online censorship. So what he is going to do to those companies is not exactly clear, but in the letter, he says that they were going to try and take broad action against them to prevent that type of censorship going forward.
Which is really kind of, I guess, ironic in a way, in that you've got Elon Musk, who owns X, who obviously is fully on board with the Trump administration. Yes. And is basically acting as though he's the vice president in some people's estimation. And then you've got Mark Zuckerberg, who earlier in the campaign was, again, came fully on board with Trump and expressed a number of the same concerns he had about his own platform. Yeah. So it's not like these platforms have been working against Trump per se lately.
No, and yet dismantling the censorship cartel, attacking social media companies and big tech has been a consistent theme of Brendan Carr's before and after he was picked to be the FCC chair.
All right, so what can he do as the chair of the FCC? I mean, what kind of authority does the FCC actually have in, I guess, carrying out some of the measures that he's already talking about?
Well, the interesting thing is that the FCC does not actually have the jurisdiction or the authority to regulate either social media companies or big tech. That's because these type of companies haven't been determined to be communication services by statute or the FCC or the courts. Yeah. But Carr is clearly signaling that he is going to try and take the FCC and go after them any way he can.
Now, in a letter that Carr wrote and posted on X, he talks of charging social media and tech companies with contributing to restrictions on free speech, but that was not addressed to Elon Musk or to X.
No.
So it's selective.
It's very selective. And he is an outspoken supporter of Elon Musk. He wrote an op-ed about a month ago in the Wall Street Journal taking Musk's side in a dispute between Musk and the FCC. The issue was over $885 million in subsidies that had been revoked from Musk's Starlink internet and tech company. Carr opposed that revocation and said it was regulatory lawfare against Musk because he's an enemy of the left.
All right, so this is the last question for you. So Carr was interviewed. He was on Fox News last week, and he made some additional statements that weren't necessarily statements that he was prepared to make, but he kind of added them in to the question that he was answering at the time as it relates to tackling some of the FCC issues when he becomes chair. One of them was potentially reviewing CBS's broadcast license for the alleged news distortion issue that came up with the 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris earlier in the campaign. What were his thoughts on the matter? What are your thoughts on what his thoughts were?
Okay. Well, he said he's going on Fox. He said he's going to shake up the status quo regarding reviewing the legacy media, referring to that news distortion complaint that had been raised against 60 Minutes. Now, the news distortion policy is an extremely obscure, almost never used policy, and it's about blatant distortions in news product, the slight editing on different platforms by 60 Minutes would never rise to that level. But once again, Carr is signaling that the Trump administration's FCC is already targeting broadcasters that the Trump administration doesn't like.
So again, targeting a lot of the mainstream, what they call the mainstream media or legacy media outlets. But I guess that would have to also then move to the cable outlets as well, including some of them that are very favorable to.
Well, that would be a consistent policy, but that is certainly not the approach that Carr has signaled that he's taking.
Not something that's been addressed as of yet, but we'll see what happens. What's good for one is necessarily not necessarily good for the other. Ian, thank you very much. We definitely appreciate you being here this morning. Be sure to stick with CBS News New York for the very latest on President-elect Trump's transition and a full list of all his cabinet picks. You can head to cbsnewsnewyork.com for a complete list.